The fence posts along the eastern boundary of Iron Ridge Ranch had been standing since 1847. Silas Mercer had cut every one of them himself from timber hauled across 30 miles of brutal New Mexico highland, each post sunk deep enough to survive wind that could strip paint off wood and winter cold that cracked iron. The land itself looked like something God had started and then abandoned halfway through. Red stone jutting from pale dirt, scrub grass that grew mean and low, arroyos that ran dry 11 months of the year and turned into roaring death traps when the rains finally came. It wasn't pretty land. It wasn't easy land. But it was Mercer land, and that made all the difference. Silas stood at the kitchen window of the ranch house that morning, coffee going cold in his hand, watching dust rise from the eastern road. He'd been awake since 4. His back hurt the way it always hurt now, a deep grinding ache that started in his spine and radiated out through his hips. 64 years old. Some days he felt every single one of them. The dust cloud was getting closer. He set the coffee down and reached for the Winchester leaning against the doorframe. The rifle was older than some of the fence posts, but he kept it clean and oiled. A working tool. He'd killed his first deer with it when he was 16. He'd killed other things since then, though he didn't dwell on that. 3 riders came into view first, then 2 more behind them, then a wagon bringing up the rear. 7 men total. Silas recognized the lead horse before he recognized the rider. A big bay gelding that belonged to Dutch Keenan, one of Holloway's foremen, which meant this wasn't a social call. Silas stepped out onto the porch and stood there waiting, rifle held loose across his chest, not pointing at anyone, but not exactly pointing away either. The riders pulled up 20 feet from the porch in a loose semicircle. Dutch Keenan was in the middle, a thick-shouldered man with a face like weathered boot leather. To his left sat Ray Cullen, younger and meaner, with the kind of eyes that enjoyed watching things hurt. The other Silas didn't know by name, but he knew the type. Hired muscle. Men who followed orders and didn't ask questions. The wagon driver was thin and nervous-looking, holding the reins like he wished he was anywhere else. "Morning, Silas," Dutch said. His voice was flat, professional. No warmth in it, but no hostility either. He was just doing a job. "Dutch," Silas said, "Mr. Holloway sent us with some papers for you to look over." "That right?" "Yes, sir. Legal documents. Fair offer for your property. More than fair, actually." Dutch pulled a folded packet from inside his coat. "He's authorized me to negotiate terms if you have concerns about the initial proposal." Silas didn't reach for the papers. "Tell Holloway I'm not selling." "Sir, I think if you just looked at the offer—" "I know what the offer is, Dutch. Holloway's been buying up land all over this territory for 3 years now. I know exactly what he offers, and I know exactly what happens when people don't take it." Ray Cullen leaned forward in his saddle, grinning. "You're talking about the Williamson place? That was unfortunate. Old man should have maintained his fences better. Cattle get loose, accidents happen." Silas looked at Cullen without blinking. 40 head of cattle don't just wander into a canyon and fall to their deaths by accident, Ray, and fences don't cut themselves. "You making accusations, old man?" "I'm stating facts." Dutch held up a hand, cutting off whatever Cullen was about to say. "Mr. Mercer, let's keep this civil. Nobody wants trouble. Mr. Holloway is offering you a legitimate business transaction. Good money for land that's barely producing anyway. You could retire comfortable, move into town, live easy." "I am living easy." "Sir, with respect, you're living alone on 40 sections of hardscrabble running, maybe 100 head of cattle. You've got no hands working for you anymore, no family helping out. You're one bad winter away from losing everything anyway. Mr. Holloway's offer is generous." "I'll die before I sell this land to Vern Holloway." The words came out quiet but absolute, the kind of statement that wasn't a threat or a boast, just simple truth. Dutch sighed and tucked the papers back into his coat. "That's a shame, Mr. Mercer. Real shame." He turned his horse, and the other riders started to follow. But then Ray Cullen stayed put, still grinning that mean little grin. "You know what I think, old man? I think you're going to reconsider real soon. I think maybe some things are going to happen around here that'll help you see reason." "Ray," Dutch said sharply. Cullen ignored him. "Could be more fences get damaged. Could be wells get fouled. Could be worse things than that. A lot of accidents can happen on a ranch this isolated." Silas's grip on the Winchester shifted slightly. "Not much. Just enough." "You threatening me, boy?" "I'm just pointing out facts, like you said." Cullen's grin widened. See you around, Mr. Mercer. He wheeled his horse and rode after the others, leaving a trail of dust hanging in the air. Silas stood on the porch until they disappeared over the eastern ridge. Then he went back inside, set the rifle down, and sat at the kitchen table. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, he was too old and too tired to be properly afraid anymore, but from anger, pure, cold anger that sat in his chest like a stone. The table was scarred oak, built by his own hands 41 years ago. His wife Martha had helped him carry it into this house the day they'd finished building it. She'd been 23 years old then, strong as a horse, laughing at how he'd made it too heavy to move easily. They'd eaten 10,000 meals at this table, raised 4 children around it, buried 2 of those children, and watched the other 3 leave, one by one, until Silas was alone with nothing but land and memory. He pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. The first letter was the hardest to start. Cal, I know we haven't spoken in 6 years. I know you blame me for how things ended with Daniel, and maybe you're right to. I'm not writing to argue about old wounds. I'm writing because I need help, and you're the only person I know who's stubborn enough and mean enough to stand against what's coming. There's a man named Vern Holloway who's been buying up ranches across the territory. He wants Iron Ridge. I told him no. His men just left here with threats that weren't subtle. I expect they'll start making good on those threats within the week. I'm an old man, Cal. I can shoot straight and I can hold ground, but I can't fight a war by myself. If you've got any of your father left in you, any of that Mercer steel that made you walk away from this family rather than bend, I'm asking you to come home. This land is worth dying for. I just need to know if it's worth someone else living for. Your father, Silas. He wrote the second letter to Jonah with different words but the same core message. Jonah, the smart one, the investigator, the son who'd gone east and made something of himself in federal law enforcement. Silas didn't know exactly what Jonah did these days, something about corruption and fraud cases, but he knew his middle son had a mind like a steel trap and a patience for detail that bordered on obsessive. The third letter went to Rhett. That one he kept shorter. Rhett didn't need long explanations. Rhett understood territory and threat and blood the way some men understood scripture. Rhett, come home. Bring your guns. Dad. He sealed the letters and rode into town that afternoon to post them. The town of Redemption sat 12 miles southeast of the ranch, a cluster of buildings that pretended to be more important than it was. General store, saloon, sheriff's office, church, hotel, and maybe 20 houses scattered around like dice tossed in the dirt. The post office was run by a widow named Agnes Pruitt, who'd been old when Silas was young and somehow just kept being old without ever dying. 3 letters, she said, peering at the addresses through spectacles thick as bottle glass. California, Washington, and is this Colorado? Yes, ma'am. That'll be 30 cents total. Silas paid and turned to leave. Silas, Agnes said quietly, you be careful. He looked back at her. What do you mean? I mean, Vern Holloway has this whole town scared silent, but that doesn't mean we're all blind. We see what he's doing. We see who pushes back and what happens to them. She glanced toward the window, then back at him. Just be careful. I will. He rode home as the sun was setting, the temperature dropping fast the way it always did in high desert country. The ranch house looked small and lonely in the failing light, smoke rising from the chimney where he'd left a fire burning. His wife's grave was 100 yards to the west, marked by a simple stone under the cottonwood trees. His youngest son Daniel's grave was right beside it. Silas had never been a man who talked to the dead, but that night he stood at the graves for a long time, hat in his hands. They're coming home, he said finally, all 3 of them. I hope that's all right with you. The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves with a sound like rushing water. Silas went inside, ate cold beans from a can, and sat at the table cleaning the Winchester until his eyes got too heavy to focus. Then he went to bed with the rifle on the floor beside him and didn't sleep at all. 3 days later, Silas woke to the smell of smoke. He was out of bed and on the porch in seconds, rifle in hand, scanning the darkness. Dawn was still an hour away, but the eastern sky had an orange glow that didn't come from the sun. The hay barn was burning. Silas ran. He wasn't a young man and his back screamed protest with every step, but he ran anyway, knowing it was already too late but running anyway because that's what you did. The barn was fully involved by the time he got close, flames punching through the roof, heat rolling out in waves that pushed him back. 20 tons of hay, winter feed for his cattle, gone. He stood there watching it burn, the rifle hanging useless in his hand, and knew this was just the beginning. By the time the sun came up, the barn was a smoking skeleton of charred timber. Silas walked the perimeter looking for evidence, a kerosene can, boot prints, anything. But whoever had set it knew what they were doing. The ground was hard-packed dirt that didn't take tracks well, and the fire had been started somewhere in the middle of the hay where it would spread fast and burn hot. He was standing there staring at the ruins when he heard horses coming from the east. For a moment his grip tightened on the Winchester, but then he recognized the gait of the lead horse and lowered the rifle. Marshal Tom Dawson rode up with one deputy, both of them looking uncomfortable. Dawson was a decent man who'd gotten old in a job that slowly ground the decency out of most people. He had a gray mustache and tired eyes, and a badge that didn't mean what it used to. "Silas," he said, dismounting, "saw the smoke from town. What happened?" "Barn caught fire sometime before dawn." Dawson walked over to the ruins, studied them for a moment, then looked back at Silas. "You got any idea how it started?" "I got ideas." "You got proof?" "No." The marshal sighed. "Look, Silas, I know you and Holloway had words. I know he wants to buy your land, but that doesn't mean—" "Tom, don't insult me. You know exactly what this is." "What I know is that I'm a territorial marshal with jurisdiction over 6 counties and not enough deputies to watch every piece of property in the Highlands. What I know is that unless you've got evidence that links someone to this fire, there's nothing I can do." "So that's it? Holloway burns down my barn and you just ride back to town?" "Silas." Dawson's voice dropped lower. "You're not the only rancher having trouble. Last month, the Hendersons lost their entire herd to poisoned water. 2 weeks ago, someone burned the Talbot homestead to the ground in the middle of the night. The Talbots barely got out alive. Every single one of those families sold to Holloway within a week of their accidents. And you did nothing. I did everything I could with what I had. I investigated. I asked questions. I filed reports. And nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything. And somehow, nobody knows anything." The marshal's jaw tightened. "You want to know the truth? The truth is Holloway's got this county locked down tighter than a drum. He's got the money, the men, and the connections. Half the people in town are on his payroll one way or another. The other half are too scared to talk." "Then what good are you?" Dawson's face went hard. "I'm the reason it hasn't gotten worse. I'm the reason Holloway's men haven't just ridden out here and put a bullet in you. They know I'd come after them for murder, even if I can't touch them for arson." Silas looked at the burned barn, then back at the marshal. "How long until that stops being true?" "I don't know," Dawson said quietly. "Not long." He mounted his horse. "My advice? Take Holloway's offer. Get out while you still can." "I'm not leaving." "Then you're a fool." The marshal rode away, his deputy following without a word. Silas stood alone in the ashes and watched them go. The water trough poisoning happened 2 days after the barn fire. Silas found 4 head of cattle dead near the north trough, bloated and stiff in the morning sun. The water had a chemical smell he didn't recognize, but the message was clear enough. He spent the rest of the day draining and scrubbing the trough, checking the other water sources, moving his remaining cattle to the southern pastures where the creek ran year-round. That night he sat on the porch with the Winchester across his lap and didn't sleep. No one came. The next night was the same, and the next. On the 4th night, Silas finally dozed off in his chair around 2 a.m. When he jerked awake an hour later, something felt wrong. He sat up, listening. Horses. Maybe 3 or 4 of them, moving slow along the western fence line. He grabbed the rifle and moved to the edge of the porch, staying in shadow. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to cast shadows. He could just make out the shapes of riders about 200 yards out, too far for a good shot. They were cutting his fence. Silas raised the Winchester and fired once into the air. The riders scattered immediately, galloping off into the darkness. He heard one of them laugh as they rode away. In the morning, he found 60 feet of fence cut and lying in the dirt. It took him most of the day to repair it, his back screaming the whole time, his hands blistered by the end. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table and stared at the 3 letters he'd sent a week ago. California. Washington, Colorado. He didn't know if his children would come, didn't know if they'd even read the letters. Cal hadn't spoken to him in 6 years. Jonah called once a year at Christmas, and the conversations never lasted more than 5 minutes. Rhett was somewhere out in the territories doing whatever Rhett did, and Silas wasn't entirely sure his youngest son even checked his mail regularly. He might be alone in this. He pulled out a piece of paper and started writing down everything he knew about Vern Holloway. It wasn't much. Nobody seemed to know where Holloway had come from originally, only that he'd arrived in the territory 3 years ago with money and ambition. He'd bought the old Cartwright Ranch first, then started expanding. Sometimes he bought land fair and square. Sometimes the deals were less fair. And sometimes people who refused to sell had unfortunate accidents until they reconsidered. The territorial government didn't seem to care. Or maybe Holloway had enough money to make sure they didn't care. Silas was still writing when he heard a horse coming up the road. He grabbed the Winchester and moved to the window, but relaxed when he saw it was just one rider coming at an easy pace. Not Holloway's men, then. They traveled in groups and they didn't announce themselves. The rider came into the yard and dismounted. Tall, lean, wearing a long coat and a flat-brimmed hat. Something familiar about the way he moved. Silas stepped out onto the porch. The rider turned and looked at him, and Silas felt something catch in his chest. "Hello, old man," Cal Mercer said. He looked different than Silas remembered. Harder somehow. The softness of youth burned away completely, leaving nothing but angles and edges. His face was weathered dark from sun and wind, his eyes pale gray and cold. He wore a badge on his coat. Territorial Marshal. He'd made something of himself. "You came," Silas said. "I came." They stood there looking at each other across 20 feet of dirt and 6 years of silence. "Barn burned down," Silas said finally. "Cattle poisoned, fences cut. They're trying to run me off." "I saw the barn." Cal walked forward slowly, leading his horse. "Saw the fence, too. Professional work. They know what they're doing. I wrote to your brothers, too." "I figured you did." Cal tied his horse to the porch rail. "Jonah still doing federal investigations?" "Last I heard." "And Rhett?" "Bounty work, I think, maybe worse." Cal almost smiled. Rhett was always going to end up doing something violent. "He gets that from your mother's side." This time Cal did smile, just a little. Then it faded. "We gonna talk about Daniel?" "Not unless you want to." "I don't." "Then we won't." They stood there in the growing darkness, father and son, strangers who shared blood and history, and not much else. "I'm glad you came," Silas said quietly. Cal nodded. "Show me everything. I want to see where they burned, where they poisoned, where they cut. I want to know their patterns." They spent the next hour walking the property, Cal asking questions and taking mental notes. He had a lawman's eye for detail, catching things Silas had missed, boot prints at the barn that were too big for local ranch hands, wire cutters that had left distinctive marks on the fence, empty tobacco tins near where the riders had waited in the dark. "How many men does Holloway have?" Cal asked. "I don't know exactly. 20, maybe 30. Not all of them are fighters. Some are just ranch hands. But some are fighters." "Yes." "Tell me about them." Silas described Dutch Keenan, Ray Cullen, and the others he'd seen. Cal listened without interrupting, filing it all away. "You know any of these men personally?" Cal asked. "Dutch used to work honest jobs before Holloway bought him. Ray Cullen's always been mean. The others I don't know." "What about the law?" "Marshal Dawson is decent but scared. He knows what's happening but can't prove it, or won't act on it, or both." Cal made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Territorial Marshal who won't do his job. That sounds about right." They walked back to the house. Cal unsaddled his horse and turned it into the small corral, moving with the easy competence of someone who'd grown up on a ranch and never quite forgotten it. Inside, Silas made coffee while Cal looked around the kitchen. Nothing had changed since he'd left. Same table, same chairs, same rifle by the door. "How's your back?" Cal asked. "How'd you know my back was bad?" "I saw how you walk, saw how you braced yourself fixing that fence." "It's fine." "You're a liar." "Yes, I am." They sat at the table drinking coffee that tasted like burnt dirt. Outside, night sounds filled the silence. Coyotes in the distance, wind moving through the scrub grass, the creak of old wood settling. "Tell me the truth," Cal said. "If your brothers don't come, can you hold this place?" "No?" Then why are you still here? Silas looked at his son across the table. Because your mother's buried here. Because Daniel's buried here. Because I built every fence and broke every horse and survived every winter on this land for 40 years. Because if I walk away now, I'm saying all of that meant nothing. It's just land, old man. No, it isn't. Cal was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you want from me?" "I want you to help me draw a line. I want you to stand with me when Holloway comes. I want—" Silas stopped, then started again. "I want my son back, even if it's just for a week." Cal looked down at his coffee. When he looked up again, something had shifted in his face. Not softness exactly, but maybe the possibility of it. "All right," he said. "I'll stand with you. But if this goes bad, if we end up backed into a corner with no way out, I'm taking you off this ranch even if I have to hogtie you and throw you over a horse." "Fair enough." They shook hands across the table, and for the first time in a week, Silas felt something other than dread. Not hope exactly, but maybe the beginning of it. But Jonah arrived 3 days later, riding in on a rented horse with saddlebags full of papers and a mind already 3 steps ahead of whatever conversation you thought you were having. He was the shortest of the Mercer brothers, barely 5'9", with dark hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of sharp, restless intelligence that made him difficult to be around for long periods. He'd inherited his mother's features, fine-boned and almost delicate, but there was nothing delicate about the way he thought. "Cal," he said, dismounting. "Jonah. Dad still alive?" "Inside." Jonah tied his horse and walked into the house without knocking. Silas was at the table, and Jonah dropped his saddlebags on the floor, pulled out a chair, and sat down like he'd never left. "Tell me everything," he said. "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out," Silas told him. Jonah listened without interrupting, but his fingers drummed constantly on the table, processing information faster than most people could speak it. When Silas finished, Jonah pulled out a notebook and started writing. "Holloway's buying land through intimidation," he said, talking more to himself than anyone else. "Burns, poisonings, fence cutting, classic pressure tactics, but he's also running legitimate business on top of it, which means paperwork. Deeds, contracts, bank transfers. If he's forging documents or falsifying sales, there'll be a trail." "Can you find it?" Cal asked. "Cal, if it exists, yes. I'll need access to county records, bank records, property deeds. I'll need to interview sellers, cross-reference dates, look for patterns." Jonah looked up at Silas. "How many ranchers has he bought out?" 15, maybe 20. "I'll need their names." Silas wrote them down from memory. Jonah took the list and started making notes, his handwriting small and precise. Cal watched him work with something that might have been admiration or might have been annoyance. "You know this might not be a legal fight, right? Holloway's not going to stop just because you find irregularities in his paperwork." "Legal fights are the only fights I know how to win," Jonah said without looking up. "You do your job, I'll do mine." Over the next 2 days, Jonah rode into town and started pulling records. He spent hours at the county clerk's office, the land registry, the bank. He interviewed families who'd sold to Holloway, taking careful notes about dates and amounts and circumstances. Most people were reluctant to talk, but Jonah had a way of asking questions that made silence feel more dangerous than honesty. What he found wasn't pretty. 3 of the deeds have signatures that don't match the seller's other legal documents, he said that evening, spreading papers across the kitchen table. At least 2 sales happened within days of mysterious fires or livestock deaths. 5 families sold for amounts well below market value, and when I asked them about it, they all gave me the same answer. They wanted to leave fast. "Is that enough?" Silas asked. "Enough to prove intimidation?" "Maybe. Enough to prove fraud?" "Not yet, but it's a start." Jonah tapped one of the deeds. "The problem is Holloway's smart. He's using real lawyers, real contracts, real money. Even when he's forcing people to sell, the paperwork looks legitimate. Unless I can find direct evidence of forged documents or prove someone was threatened into signing." He trailed off, staring at the papers like they were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Cal leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "So we need someone on the inside, someone who knows how Holloway operates and is willing to talk." "That would help," Jonah admitted. "Good luck with that," Silas said. "Holloway's got this whole town scared silent." "Not everyone," Jonah said quietly. "Someone always knows something. You just have to find the right pressure point. And Rhett Mercer arrived on the 8th day, and he didn't come alone. Silas was in the yard working on a broken wagon wheel when he heard horses, multiple horses, moving fast. Cal was beside him immediately, hand on his pistol. Jonah came out of the house holding a rifle he barely knew how to use. But then Silas saw the lead rider and relaxed. Rhett sat a black stallion like he was part of the animal, moving with an easy grace that made everything look effortless. He was the youngest of the brothers at 29 and the most dangerous. He had his father's height and build, but his mother's dark hair and dark eyes, and there was something predatory in the way he watched the world. Behind him rode 2 other men Silas didn't recognize. "Dad," Rhett said, reining in his horse. "Cal, Jonah." He gestured to the riders behind him. "This is Jack Brennan and Sam Polk. They're friends." The 2 men nodded but didn't dismount. They had the look of men who'd seen hard country and done hard things, weathered, watchful, competent. "You brought help," Cal said. "Figured you'd need it." Rhett swung down from his horse with fluid ease. "Brennan's good with a rifle. Polk's good with everything else. They're both good at not asking questions." "We paying them?" Silas asked. "Already paid, don't worry about it." Rhett walked to the burned barn and stood there studying the ruins. Then he walked the fence line, examined the poisoned water trough, and came back to where his brothers were waiting. "Professional work," he said. "Whoever Holloway's got doing this knows what they're doing." "We figured that out already," Cal said. "Yeah, but did you figure out who?" Rhett pulled a piece of paper from his coat. "I asked around before I came. Holloway's top enforcer is a man named Ray Cullen. Mean as a snake, likes hurting things. His second is Dutch Keenan, older, smarter, doesn't enjoy the violence, but doesn't mind it either. They've got maybe 10 or 12 men who will actually fight if it comes to that. The rest are just ranch hands collecting paychecks." "How'd you get all that in 3 days?" Jonah asked. Rhett smiled. "I'm good at finding things out." That night, all 3 brothers sat around the kitchen table with their father for the first time in 6 years. The air was thick with things unsaid. Daniel's death, their mother's death, years of silence and resentment and buried grief. But for now, they pushed all of that aside and talked about the problem in front of them. "Holloway's going to escalate," Cal said. "We've been here over a week and nothing's happened. That means he's planning something bigger." "Let him plan," Rhett said. "We're ready." "Are we?" Jonah looked around the table. "We're 4 men and 2 hired guns sitting on 40 sections of open land. If Holloway brings 20 riders, we can't defend all of it." "We don't have to defend all of it," Cal said. "We just have to make it cost more than it's worth." "He spent 3 years building an empire," Silas said quietly. "This ranch is the last piece. He's not going to walk away." "Then we'll make him run," Rhett said. They sat there in the lamplight, 4 men bound by blood and land and something that might have been love if you squinted hard enough. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and somewhere in the darkness a coyote howled. The war was coming. They all felt it. The attack came at dawn 3 days later. Silas was awake before the sun, same as always. Cal was on the porch keeping watch. Jonah was asleep in what used to be his old room. Rhett and his 2 men were camped out near the barn ruins, rotating watch through the night. Cal saw them first, a line of riders coming from the east, spread out wide, maybe 15 strong. "Riders!" he shouted. The ranch exploded into motion. Silas grabbed his Winchester. Jonah stumbled out of bed. Rhett and his men were mounted and moving within seconds. The riders stopped just outside rifle range, a loose line of men on horseback silhouetted against the rising sun. Vern Holloway rode forward alone. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders and chest, wearing expensive clothes that looked wrong in ranch country. His face was red and fleshy, his eyes small and mean. He rode like someone who'd learned late in life and never quite got comfortable with it. "Silas Mercer," he shouted, "I'm here to make one final offer." Silas walked to the edge of the porch, Cal beside him. Rhett rode up from the left, flanked by Brennan and Polk. Jonah stood at the window with the rifle. "I'm not selling Holloway," Silas shouted back. "You will." Holloway gestured to the men behind him. "I've got 15 men here and 20 more I can call in. You've got what? 3 sons and some hired help? This doesn't end well for you, old man." "Then why are you talking instead of shooting?" Holloway's face got redder. Because I'm a businessman. I don't want violence. I want a fair transaction. Nothing fair about burning barns and poisoning cattle. Prove it. Holloway spread his hands. You've got no evidence I had anything to do with your misfortunes. Hell, maybe you're just a careless old fool who let his own barn burn down. Ray Cullen laughed from somewhere in the line of riders. Cal's hand moved to his pistol, but Silas put a hand on his arm. Last chance, Mercer, Holloway shouted. Sell or suffer the consequences. Go to hell! Holloway stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, you had your chance. He wheeled his horse and rode back to his men. They conferred briefly, then the whole group turned and rode away. That's it? Jonah said from the window. They're just leaving? No, Cal said quietly. They're regrouping. This was reconnaissance. They wanted to see what we had, how we'd react. So what now? Silas asked. Rhett was already riding back toward the barn. Now we get ready for the real fight. They spent the rest of that day fortifying what could be fortified and accepting what couldn't. The ranch house sat in open ground with maybe 40 yards of clear space on all sides before you hit scrub brush and arroyos. Good for seeing trouble coming, bad for cover if trouble came with rifles. Cal walked the perimeter 3 times, making mental notes. We can hold the house if we have to, he said. Stone foundation, thick walls, good sight lines. But if they come at night with torches, we're in trouble. They won't burn us out, Silas said. Holloway wants the land, not ashes. He wanted you gone peaceful, and that didn't work. Don't assume he's rational anymore. Cal pointed toward the barn ruins. Rhett, you and your boys set up there. You'll have cover and elevation. Anyone comes from the east, you'll see them first. Rhett nodded and rode off with Brennan and Polk. Jonah was at the table inside, surrounded by papers. He'd spent the morning in town again, talking to people, copying records, building his case piece by piece. Now he looked up with tired eyes. I found something, he said. The Henderson Ranch, the one that lost cattle to poisoned water 3 months ago. They sold to Holloway for $8,000. The property was assessed at $14,000. That's a hell of a discount, Cal said. It gets better. I talked to Henderson's daughter. She says her father didn't want to sell at all, but 2 days after the poisoning, someone rode onto their property at night and fired shots through their windows. Her mother was so terrified they packed up and left within the week. Silas felt something cold settle in his gut. Did she say who did the shooting? She didn't see them, but she remembered one of the horses, a big bay gelding with a white blaze. Dutch Keenan's horse, Silas said. That's circumstantial, Cal said. Won't hold up anywhere that matters. It will if we get Keenan to talk. Jonah tapped his papers. I've got 3 other families with similar stories. Accidents, threats, quick sales at bad prices. If I can get one of Holloway's men to flip, I can connect all of it back to him. Good luck getting anyone to testify, Silas said. They're all scared. Or paid off, Cal added. Jonah just smiled, thin and sharp. Everyone has a price. Some people's price is money. Some people's price is staying out of prison. The afternoon passed in tense quiet. Rhett and his men dug rifle pits near the barn ruins and stacked rocks for cover. Cal checked ammunition, cleaned weapons, made sure everyone knew their fields of fire. Silas tried to keep busy, but mostly just got in the way, his back aching, his hands shaking slightly from something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. By evening, nothing had happened. They ate a silent dinner, beans and salt pork and coffee that tasted like dirt. Afterward, Cal posted watch rotations. 2 men awake at all times, positions staggered, no lights after dark. They might not come tonight, Rhett said. Holloway's not stupid. He knows we're ready now. They'll come, Silas said. Maybe not tonight, but soon. Holloway's got too much money invested in this territory to back down now. Let him come, Cal said quietly. We're ready. But ready was relative. They had 6 men total counting Silas, who couldn't shoot as straight as he used to and couldn't move as fast as he needed to. Holloway had at least 20, probably more, and unlimited resources to hire more if he wanted. The math didn't favor them. That night, Silas lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the windows. Somewhere outside, Cal was on watch. Somewhere in the barn ruins, Rhett was doing the same. And somewhere in town, Holloway was planning his next move. Sleep came eventually, restless and thin. He woke to gunfire. Not close, maybe half a mile out, but unmistakable. 3 shots, Evenly spaced, then silence. Silas was out of bed and grabbing his rifle before he was fully awake. Cal was already at the window, peering into darkness. "Can't see anything," he said. "Too dark." More shots, closer now, then shouting. The door crashed open and Rhett came through fast, breathing hard. "They're burning the southern fence line." Brennan counted at least 8 riders. "They're trying to draw us out." "Do we go?" Cal asked. Silas looked at his sons. Cal, disciplined and cautious. Rhett, dangerous and eager. Both of them waiting for him to decide. "No," he said. "We hold here. The fence can be rebuilt. We can't." "They're going to burn every fence you've got if we don't stop them," Rhett said. "I know." Rhett looked like he wanted to argue, but Cal put a hand on his shoulder. "Dad's right. They want us scattered and vulnerable. We stay together." They watched from the windows as orange light flickered in the distance. The fence line burned for an hour before dying down to embers. In the morning, Silas would find 3 miles of wire and posts destroyed, cattle scattered across the highlands. Months of work turned to ash. But they were all still alive. Dawn came gray and cold. Silas stood on the porch looking south at the smoke still rising from the ruined fence line and felt something inside him harden past the point where it could bend anymore. "This is what they do," he said to Cal, who stood beside him. "They take pieces of you until there's nothing left worth fighting for." "We're still here." "For how long?" Cal didn't have an answer for that. Jonah rode into town that morning despite Cal's protests that it wasn't safe. "I'm not a fighter," he said. "I'm an investigator, and I've got work to do." He came back 6 hours later looking pleased with himself. "I found the weak link," he announced, dropping into a chair at the kitchen table. "Marshal Dawson." "Tom's not going to help us," Silas said. "He made that clear." "He doesn't have to help us. He just has to do his job." Jonah pulled out his notebook. "I spent the afternoon going through territorial law. Turns out there's a statute about investigating property crimes when there's a pattern of incidents. If a marshal receives formal complaints about repeated criminal activity in his jurisdiction, he's required to investigate or face sanctions from the territorial governor." "So file a complaint," Cal said. "I filed 6. 1 for every family that's had suspicious incidents before selling to Holloway. All properly documented. All following the letter of the law." Jonah smiled. "Dawson can ignore 1 complaint. He can't ignore 6 without it looking like dereliction of duty." "That's going to make him mad," Silas said. "That's going to make him do something," Jonah corrected, "whether he wants to or not." 3 days passed. The fence line stayed burned. No more attacks came, but the pressure was constant. Holloway's riders patrolling the borders of the ranch, always visible, always watching. A reminder that they were surrounded. Silas spent those days moving cattle, salvaging what he could from the burned fence, trying to keep his mind busy. His back got worse. Some mornings he could barely stand up straight, and he'd catch his sons watching him with expressions that looked too much like pity. On the 4th day, Marshal Dawson rode out to the ranch alone. He looked older than he had a week ago, more tired, more worn down. He dismounted slowly and stood there holding his horse's reins like he wasn't sure he wanted to stay. "Jonah," he said, "you're making trouble for me. I'm asking you to do your job. I've been doing my job for 20 years. Don't lecture me about duty. Then investigate the complaints. 6 families, all with documented incidents, all selling to the same buyer at below-market prices. That's a pattern. That's your jurisdiction." Dawson's jaw tightened. "You know what investigating Holloway means? It means half the town stops talking to me. It means my deputies start looking for other work because they're afraid of getting killed. It means I make an enemy out of the richest, most powerful man in 6 counties. It also means doing what's right," Silas said from the porch. "Right doesn't pay my salary. Right doesn't keep my wife safe. Right doesn't—" Dawson stopped, took a breath. "You people don't understand what you're asking." "We understand perfectly," Cal said. He'd moved to the edge of the porch, hand resting casual on his pistol. "You're scared. That's fine. We're all scared. But you've got a badge and a duty, and if you're not willing to honor that, you should take the badge off and go home." "You threatening me, Cal?" "I'm stating facts. You want to hide behind fear, that's your choice. But don't pretend it's anything noble." For a moment, Silas thought Dawson might draw on Cal. The marshal's hand twitched toward his gun, then stopped. He looked at all of them. Silas on the porch, Cal ready to fight, Jonah watching with those sharp, calculating eyes, Rhett leaning against the wall like violence was just another conversation. "All right," Dawson said finally. "I'll investigate. I'll interview the families, review the property records, look into the incidents. But I'm telling you right now, even if I find evidence of wrongdoing, getting charges to stick against someone like Holloway is damn near impossible." "That's not your problem," Jonah said. "Your problem is conducting a legitimate investigation. What happens after that is federal jurisdiction." "Federal?" Dawson's eyes narrowed. "What are you planning?" "My job," Jonah said. "Same as you." The marshal left looking troubled, and Silas couldn't blame him. They were pushing against something bigger than any of them, something with money and power and no conscience at all. That night, sitting around the table, Cal voiced what they were all thinking. "Holloway's going to escalate again. We embarrassed him. We're still here. He can't let that stand." "Let him come," Rhett said. He was cleaning his pistol, movements automatic and practiced. "I'm tired of waiting." "We're not ready for a full assault," Cal said. "We're never going to be ready for that. We're 6 men. 7, Silas corrected. "I can still shoot." "Dad," Cal started. "Don't. I built this place. I'll defend it. That's not negotiable." They stared at each other across the table, and for a moment Silas saw his son as he used to be, younger, softer, before the territory, and the badge and the violence had carved away everything but iron. 7 men, Cal said finally. "Against 20 or 30. Battles have been won with worse odds," Rhett said, "and lost with better ones." Jonah closed his notebook. "We need an advantage, something that changes the equation." "Like what?" Silas asked. "I don't know yet, but I'll find it." The advantage came from an unexpected direction. 2 days later, Agnes Pruitt from the post office rode out to the ranch on a mule, moving slow and careful. She was 80, if she was a day, thin as a rail, and had more courage than half the men in the territory. Silas met her in the yard. "Miss Agnes, what are you doing out here?" "Bringing information." She climbed down from the mule with difficulty. "And maybe getting myself killed, but at my age, what's the difference?" She pulled an envelope from her coat. "This came for you yesterday. Telegram from Denver. I thought you'd want to see it right away." Silas opened the envelope. The telegram was short. "Federal warrant approved stop land fraud investigation. Authorized stop arriving Tuesday with marshals stop J. Mercer." He read it twice, then looked at Agnes. "You know what this says? I know Jonah's been making trouble in town, asking questions, copying records. I know Holloway's men have been watching him, and I know that boy's too smart to do all that without a plan." She smiled, showing missing teeth. "I also know you Mercers are about the only people left with spines in this whole territory, and I figured you could use some help. This is dangerous information to be carrying around. Everything's dangerous now." She climbed back on her mule. "There's something else you should know. Holloway's planning something big. I heard Dutch Keenan talking in the general store yesterday. They're bringing in men from outside the territory, professional guns. Whatever's coming, it's coming soon." She rode away before Silas could thank her properly. That evening, Silas showed the telegram to his sons. Jonah read it and smiled. "I filed a federal complaint 2 weeks ago. Took that long for it to work through the system, but now we've got official support coming." "When's Tuesday?" Cal asked. 4 days from now." "That's not soon enough," Rhett said. "If Agnes is right, Holloway's going to move before then." "Then we hold for 4 days," Cal said. "Whatever it takes." They didn't have to wait that long. The attack came the next night, and it came hard. Silas was on watch, standing in the darkness near the house, when he heard horses, lots of horses, moving fast from multiple directions. He fired his rifle once into the air, the signal they'd arranged, and the ranch erupted into controlled chaos. Cal came out of the house already shooting. Rhett and his men opened up from the barn ruins. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like lightning. There were at least 20 riders, maybe more, coming from east and south in 2 separate groups. They'd planned this, coordinated it, timed it for maximum confusion. Bullets tore through the air, one splintered wood near Silas's head, and he dropped flat, rolled behind the water trough, came up shooting. He hit a horse, saw it stumble and throw its rider, then ducked as return fire chewed up the ground around him. The riders split apart, some heading for the house, others toward the barn. They were trying to divide the defenders, forced them to choose which position to hold. Cal was at the house window, firing methodically, picking targets. Jonah was somewhere inside, and Silas hoped to hell his middle son had the sense to stay down. From the barn ruins, Rhett's rifles opened up steady and precise. Brennan was a marksman. Silas could tell by the rhythm of his shots, spaced evenly, never wasted. One rider went down, then another. But there were too many of them. A group of 5 riders made it to the house and dismounted, taking cover behind the corral fence. They started laying down suppressing fire, keeping Cal pinned at the window. Silas ran for the house, his back screaming protest, bullets kicking up dirt at his heels. He made it to the porch and crashed through the door, breathing hard. "You hit?" Cal asked, without taking his eyes off the window. "No, you?" "Not yet." Jonah was crouched in the corner holding a pistol, like it might bite him. "How many are there?" "Too many," Silas said. Outside, the shooting continued. Rhett's group was holding the barn position, but 3 riders had circled around and were trying to flank them. Silas saw muzzle flashes in the darkness, heard shouting, couldn't tell who was winning. Then someone threw a torch. It arced through the air, trailing sparks, and landed on the roof of the house. The old wood caught immediately, flames spreading fast. "Roof's on fire!" Jonah yelled. Cal swore and kept shooting. "We can't leave the window or they'll storm the house." "We can't stay if it's burning." Silas grabbed a bucket of water they'd kept ready for exactly this and ran for the ladder to the loft. His back seized up halfway up and he nearly fell, but he gritted his teeth and kept climbing. The roof was fully involved by the time he got up there, flames eating through old cedar shingles, smoke choking him. He threw the water on the nearest flames. It helped about as much as spitting would have. Another torch came flying through the darkness. This one hit the porch. "We have to move," Cal shouted. "Fall back to the barn." They ran, Cal first providing cover fire, then Jonah stumbling along behind, then Silas bringing up the rear with the Winchester. Bullets chased them across the yard. Silas felt one pass so close it burned the air near his ear. They made it to the barn ruins and dove into the rifle pits Rhett had dug. The position was better than the house, more cover, better angles, but they were giving up the building their family had lived in for 40 years. Silas watched the house burn, flames reaching toward the black sky, and felt something break inside him that wasn't ever going to heal. "Keep firing," Rhett shouted. "Don't let them get organized." The fight settled into a brutal stalemate. Holloway's men had numbers, but the Mercers had position and determination. Every time the riders tried to advance, accurate rifle fire drove them back. Every time they tried to flank, someone was there to meet them. But ammunition was finite, and the night was long. Around midnight, the shooting started to taper off. Holloway's men pulled back out of rifle range, regrouping. The house was a smoking ruin by then. Most of the roof collapsed, walls still standing but gutted inside. Cal did a quick count. "We're down to maybe 30 rounds total. If they come again, we won't be able to hold." "They don't know that," Rhett said. "They'll figure it out when we stop shooting." Silas looked at his sons in the darkness, all of them powder-burned and exhausted, and wondered if this was how it ended. Burned out, shot up, surrounded by men with more bullets and less conscience. Then he heard a voice from the darkness. "Silas Mercer!" It was Holloway shouting from somewhere past the burned house. "I'm done playing games. You've got 10 minutes to walk off this property, or we're coming in and killing every last one of you." "Don't answer him," Cal whispered. But Silas was already standing up, rifle in hand, stepping to where Holloway could see him silhouetted against the dying fire. "You want this land so bad? Come take it," he shouted back. "But you'll pay in blood for every inch. You old fool! I've got 30 men. You've got what, 5, 6? You can't win this." "Maybe not, but I can make sure you lose more than you gain." There was a long silence. Then Holloway's voice came back, colder now. "Have it your way. When the sun comes up, we're burning everything else you've got. Every fence, every building, every blade of grass. And then we're coming for you." The riders pulled back into the darkness, leaving the Mercers alone with the burning house and the knowledge that dawn would bring something worse. They spent the rest of the night in the rifle pits, taking turns on watch, trying not to think about the odds they faced. Silas sat with his back against cold stone, the Winchester across his lap, and thought about his wife buried under the cottonwoods. Thought about Daniel, who died too young doing something stupid and brave. Thought about whether fighting for land was noble or just stubborn. You should have sold, Cal said quietly from beside him. Probably. This might get us all killed. I know. Was it worth it? Silas looked at his son. Ask me again if we survive. Dawn came cold and gray. The house was still smoking, reduced to blackened walls and ash. Holloway's men were visible on the eastern ridge. 30 riders at least, maybe more. They sat there waiting, letting the Mercers see exactly how outmatched they were. Around 8 in the morning, a single rider approached under a white flag. It was Dutch Keenan. He stopped 50 yards out and called, "I need to talk to Jonah Mercer." Jonah stood up from the rifle pit, ignoring Cal's protest. "I'm here. Mr. Holloway wants you to know he's got no quarrel with you. You're federal. You're just doing your job. If you want to walk away right now, he'll let you leave unharmed. Tell Holloway I'm not going anywhere. Don't be stupid, son. This isn't your fight." "The hell it isn't," Jonah's voice carried across the empty ground. "I've got 6 documented cases of fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy. I've got federal marshals arriving Tuesday with arrest warrants. Holloway can burn this ranch to the ground, but he can't burn the evidence I've already sent to Denver." Dutch sat his horse in silence for a moment. Then he turned and rode back to the ridge. "You think that'll make a difference?" Rhett asked. "It might," Jonah said. "Holloway's a businessman. He understands risk. If he knows the federal government is already involved." "He'll kill us to cover his tracks," Cal finished. "That's what I'd do." But nothing happened. The riders stayed on the ridge, visible but unmoving. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. Silas's back hurt so bad he could barely stand, and the exhaustion was starting to make everything feel unreal, like he was watching someone else's life from a distance. Around noon, one of Holloway's men rode into town and came back fast. There was a commotion on the ridge, riders gathering, voices raised, someone pointing. Then the whole group wheeled their horses and rode away, just like that. 30 men, gone in minutes. The Mercers stood in the rifle pits watching them disappear, too tired and confused to move. "What the hell just happened?" Rhett said. They found out an hour later when Marshal Dawson rode up with 3 deputies and a telegram. "Federal marshals arrived early," he said, dismounting. "Came in on the morning train. They're in town right now with arrest warrants for Vern Holloway, Dutch Keenan, Ray Cullen, and 6 others. Charges include land fraud, conspiracy, intimidation, arson, and attempted murder." Silas sat down hard on a rock. "How?" Dawson handed the telegram to Jonah. "Your investigation. You built a case the federal government couldn't ignore. They sent a judge and 4 marshals. Holloway's in custody. It's over." "Just like that?" Cal said. "After all this, it just ends?" "Not quite." Dawson looked uncomfortable. "Holloway's got expensive lawyers. The federal case is solid, but he'll fight it. Could take months, maybe years to work through the courts. But he's done in this territory," Jonah said, reading the telegram. "The warrants are public record. Every family he intimidated is going to come forward now. Every forged deed, every threatened sale, every burned barn. It all comes out." "He'll probably get prison time," Dawson added. 10 years minimum if the charges stick." Silas looked at the burned house, the ruined fences, the rifle pits they'd defended through the night. He looked at his sons, all of them still breathing, still standing. "We won," he said quietly. "Yeah," Cal said. "We did." But it didn't feel like winning. It felt like surviving, which wasn't quite the same thing. They spent the rest of that day cleaning weapons, counting costs, trying to process what had happened. The house was a total loss. 3 miles of fence needed rebuilding. Cattle were scattered across 2 counties. The hay barn was still just a charred skeleton. That evening, sitting in the ruins of the barn because they had nowhere else to sit, Jonah showed them the paperwork he'd compiled. 6 families willing to testify about intimidation. 4 forged deeds. Bank records showing Holloway paid known criminals for security services that coincided with barn fires and livestock deaths. Testimony from 2 of his own men who decided cooperating with federal marshals was better than going to prison. "Who flipped?" Rhett asked. "Dutch Keenan, for one. When he realized the federal government was involved, he made a deal. Ray Cullen's going down hard, but Dutch gets reduced charges in exchange for testimony." "Smart man," Cal said. "Scared man," Jonah corrected, "but I'll take it." Silas listened to his sons talk. watched them piece together how the victory had been won, and felt a strange mix of pride and sorrow. They'd saved the ranch, but they'd lost the house. They'd beaten Holloway, but the cost had been high. And somewhere in all of this, they'd become a family again. Not the family they used to be. That was gone, burned away along with the house. But maybe something new, something harder and more honest. "What now?" he asked. They all looked at him. "We rebuild," Cal said simply. "What else is there?" "You staying?" Silas asked. "For a while. Long enough to help get the fences up and the house started." "Jonah?" "I've got to go back to Denver next week, but I'll come back when I can." "Rhett?" The youngest son was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've got business elsewhere, but this is still home. I'll be around." It wasn't everything Silas had hoped for, but it was more than he'd had 2 weeks ago. That night, the four of them slept in the barn ruins under cold stars, and for the first time since the letters were sent, Silas slept without fear. The war was over. Tomorrow, they'd start picking up pieces. The federal marshals stayed in Redemption for 3 days, taking statements and gathering evidence. Silas gave his testimony in the charred remains of what used to be his kitchen, standing among blackened timbers and melted glass while a young marshal with neat handwriting documented every threat, every burned fence, every poisoned well. "You're lucky to be alive," the marshal said when they finished. "Luck had nothing to do with it," Silas replied. "The truth was more complicated than luck." They'd survived because Jonah had been smart enough to build a federal case before the shooting started, because Cal had been disciplined enough to hold defensive positions when attacking would have been easier, because Rhett had brought guns and men who knew how to use them, and maybe because Silas himself had been too stubborn to die quietly. But survival wasn't the same as victory, and victory wasn't the same as justice. Holloway sat in the Redemption jail for 2 days before his lawyers arrived from Santa Fe, with a writ of habeas corpus and enough legal maneuvering to get him moved to the territorial capital for trial. The federal marshals didn't like it, but they didn't have much choice. The law had procedures, and procedures took time. "He's going to walk," Cal said, the morning they transferred Holloway out of town. They stood on the street watching the prisoner wagon roll past, Holloway visible through the barred window, looking smug. "Maybe," Jonah said, "but even if he beats the criminal charges, the civil suits are going to destroy him. Every family he forced out is filing claims now. The Hendersons' lawyer contacted me yesterday. So did the Talbots and the Williamsons. They smell blood in the water. Money doesn't bring back what was lost." "No, but it's something." They watched the wagon disappear down the road toward Santa Fe, and Silas felt an emptiness that had nothing to do with Holloway and everything to do with the burned house behind them. Rebuilding started that afternoon. Cal and Rhett rode out to round up scattered cattle while Silas and Jonah began salvaging what they could from the house. There wasn't much. The fire had taken most of it: furniture, clothes, 40 years of accumulated life reduced to ash and twisted metal. But the stone foundation was intact, and some of the wall framing could be saved if they worked carefully. Silas found his wife's Bible in the ruins, the leather cover charred, but the pages inside mostly readable. He found Daniel's baby shoes in a metal box that had survived the heat. He found a photograph of the family taken 15 years ago, the glass cracked and the edges burned, but the faces still visible. Martha smiling, the boys young and whole, everyone together before death and distance tore them apart. He stood there holding the photograph, and Jonah found him like that, just standing in the ashes with tears running down his face. "Dad," Jonah said quietly, "I'm fine." "You're not." Silas wiped his eyes roughly. "We lost the house. Everything your mother and I built. Everything we—" His voice broke. "I should have sold. Should have taken Holloway's money and walked away. At least we'd still have something." "We do have something," Jonah said. "We have the land. We have each other. That's more than most people get. Your mother would have hated this. The violence, the burning, all of it. Mom would have shot Holloway herself if she thought it would protect her family." Jonah picked up a piece of charred wood and examined it. "You remember when the Fenwick boys tried to rustle our cattle back in '83? She grabbed Dad's rifle and fired warning shots until they rode off. Then she made us all lemonade like nothing happened." Despite everything, Silas smiled. "She was terrifying when she wanted to be." "She was. And she'd tell you right now to stop feeling sorry for yourself and get back to work." They spent the rest of the day pulling nails from salvageable lumber, sorting through debris, making lists of what needed to be replaced. It was hot, dirty work that made Silas's back scream, but it felt good to be doing something productive instead of just waiting for the next disaster. Cal and Rhett came back at sunset with 30 head of cattle they'd found scattered in the eastern canyons. More were still out there, maybe 100 head total if they were lucky. The herd had taken years to build, and losing even part of it hurt. That night they made camp in the barn ruins again, cooking beans over an open fire and sharing a bottle of whiskey Rhett had produced from his saddlebags. "Where'd you get this?" Cal asked, taking a sip. "Don't ask questions you don't want answered." They sat in silence for a while, passing the bottle, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. "I've been thinking," Silas said, "about what comes next." "We rebuild the house," Cal said. "Fix the fences, round up the cattle, same as always. I mean, after that, long term." Silas took the whiskey bottle, stared at it without drinking. "I'm 64 years old, my back's shot, my hands shake, and I can't do this alone anymore." "You're not alone," Jonah said. "You're going back to Denver. Rhett's got whatever business he's got. Cal's got his marshal duties. I can't expect you boys to stay here forever." "So what are you saying?" Rhett asked. "I'm saying maybe it's time to think about the future of this place, whether it makes sense to keep ranching, whether—" He stopped, the words harder to say than he'd expected. "Whether this land is worth what it costs to keep it." The silence that followed was heavy. Finally, Cal spoke. "You want to sell. I want to consider all options. After everything we just went through, you want to walk away?" "I want to be realistic. We won the battle, but we didn't win the war. Holloway's gone, but there'll be others like him. Men with money and lawyers who want what we've got, and I don't have the strength to fight them all off." "Then we make the ranch sustainable," Jonah said. "Hire hands, modernize operations, stop trying to do everything yourself." "With what money? The hay barn's destroyed, the house is gone. Rebuilding is going to cost more than I've got." "I've got money," Cal said. "So do I," Jonah added. Rhett was quiet for a moment, then said, "I don't have much, but what I've got is yours." Silas looked at his sons, these men who'd come back when he called, who'd stood beside him against impossible odds, who were now offering everything they had to save a piece of land that might not be worth saving. "I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking," Cal said. "We're offering. This is our home too. Maybe we left. Maybe we stayed away too long, but that doesn't change what this place means." "What does it mean?" Silas asked. "Honestly, because some days I can't remember anymore." Rhett took the whiskey bottle and drank deep. "It means we're Mercers. It means our mother's buried here and our brother's buried here, and 40 years of your life are in this dirt. You can put a price on land, but you can't put a price on that." "Besides," Jonah added, "if we let Holloway win by walking away after he's already lost, what's the point of everything we just did?" Silas thought about that. Thought about Martha under the cottonwoods. Thought about Daniel, who'd died breaking a horse that was too wild, too young, too proud to accept a rider. Thought about the fence posts he'd set himself, the cattle he'd raised, the storms he'd survived. "All right," he said, "we rebuild, but we do it right this time. Hire help, modernize, make this place sustainable for whoever comes after." "Agreed," Cal said. They shook hands on it, and Silas felt something settle in his chest that might have been hope, or might have just been exhaustion, masked as optimism. The next morning, word spread through Redemption that the Mercers were hiring. By noon, 6 men had ridden out to the ranch looking for work. Most of them were locals who'd been afraid to help while Holloway was a threat, but were willing enough now that the danger had passed. Cal interviewed them one by one, asking about experience, checking references, making it clear that working for the Mercers meant hard labor and fair pay and nothing else. They hired 3, a young cowhand named Miguel, who knew cattle, an older carpenter named Sam, who'd helped build half the houses in the county, and a quiet man called just Polk, who turned out to be one of Rhett's friends deciding to stick around. "Wait," Silas said when he realized. "Your friend Polk is staying?" "He likes the work," Rhett said. "And he's tired of bounty hunting. Figured ranch life might suit him." "You paying him?" "He's working for room and board until we get back on our feet. Then regular wages." Silas didn't ask what kind of man gave up bounty hunting to work on a ranch for free. He just accepted that his youngest son collected dangerous people the way some men collected stamps. With help, the work went faster. Sam the carpenter surveyed the burned house and declared the foundation sound enough to rebuild on, though they'd need to order lumber from Santa Fe and the cost would be significant. Miguel started rounding up cattle systematically, working the canyons and arroyos with a patience that reminded Silas of himself at that age. Polk rebuilt the southern fence line without being asked, working alone and speaking to no one. Cal rode into town every other day to check with Marshal Dawson about the federal case. The news was mixed. Holloway's lawyers were fighting every charge, filing motions, demanding continuances, doing everything possible to delay trial. But more families were coming forward with testimony, and the evidence kept piling up. The federal prosecutor says they've got him on at least 3 counts of fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy, Cal reported one evening. The attempted murder charges are harder to prove since nobody actually died, but the rest is solid. How long until trial? Silas asked. 6 months, maybe a year. Federal courts move slow. And in the meantime? In the meantime, Holloway's out on bail living in Santa Fe, and his business empire is falling apart. The ranch he built his operation from is being foreclosed on. His partners are distancing themselves. He's toxic now. Good, Silas said with feeling. A week after the attack, Jonah rode back to Denver to file his final reports and close out the federal investigation. He left behind copies of all his documentation and a promise to return within the month. Keep building the case, he told Cal before he left. Every family that testifies makes it harder for Holloway to wiggle out. Every piece of evidence is another nail in the coffin. You really think he's going to prison? I think he's going to lose everything that matters to him. Whether that's in a cell or just in bankruptcy court, I don't care. Either way, he's finished in this territory. Jonah left at dawn, and the ranch felt quieter without him. He'd always been the smart one, the one who thought 3 moves ahead, and his absence left a gap that was hard to fill. But the work continued. They framed the new house in 2 weeks. A smaller structure than before, more practical, less sentimental. Sam the carpenter worked with the efficiency of someone who'd built 100 houses and knew exactly which corners could be cut and which couldn't. The walls went up straight and true, the roof frame was solid, and by the end of the month they had something that looked like a home again. Silas spent most of his time working on fences. His back couldn't handle the heavy lifting anymore, but he could string wire and set posts if he worked slow and took breaks. Cal usually worked beside him, and they'd fall into conversations that started about fence posts and ended up somewhere else entirely. You ever think about settling down? Silas asked one afternoon while they were stretching wire. What do you mean? I mean getting married, having kids, building something. Cal was quiet for a long moment. I thought about it once. There was a woman in Albuquerque, school teacher, smart, pretty, patient enough to put up with me, but the job got in the way. Always does. The job or the Mercer in you? Maybe both. Cal pulled the wire tight and stapled it to the post. We're not easy people to love, are we? Your mother managed. Mom was exceptional. Yes, she was. Silas moved to the next post, feeling the ache in his spine intensify. You know what I regret most? The years I wasted being angry at you boys for leaving. You had your own lives to live, your own paths to walk. I should have accepted that instead of holding grudges. We could have visited more. I could have made it easier for you to want to. They worked in silence for a while, the sound of hammers and wire the only conversation needed. That evening, sitting on the porch of the half-finished house, watching the sun set over land that had nearly killed them all, Silas felt something shift. The anger that had lived in his chest for so long, anger at his sons for leaving, anger at himself for driving them away, anger at a world that took his wife and his youngest son, it started to fade, replaced by something that wasn't quite peace, but was close enough. 2 weeks later, Marshal Dawson rode out with news. Ray Cullen's dead, he said without preamble. Silas set down the hammer he'd been using. How? Shot in a saloon fight in Socorro. Apparently he'd been drinking and bragging about how he was going to skip town before the trial, and someone took exception to his attitude. Someone, Cal repeated slowly. Dawson met his eyes. Someone who doesn't want to be identified. The local sheriff ruled it self-defense. No charges filed. After the marshal left, Cal and Silas exchanged a look. You think Rhett? Silas started. I don't think anything, Cal said firmly, and neither should you. But when Rhett rode in that evening from wherever he'd been for the past 3 days, there was something in his eyes that Silas recognized. The look of a man who'd done something necessary and wasn't particularly troubled by it. They didn't talk about it. Some things were better left unexamined. The house was finished in mid-September, 6 weeks after the fire. It was smaller than the original, more practical, with a functional kitchen and 3 bedrooms instead of 5. Sam had done good work. The walls were square, the roof was tight, and the windows actually opened without sticking. Silas moved in his salvaged belongings and found himself standing in the middle of the new kitchen, feeling like a stranger in his own home. Everything was wrong, the proportions different, the light coming from the wrong angles, the sounds unfamiliar. Give it time, Cal said, reading his expression. It'll feel like home eventually. Will it? It has to. We don't have anywhere else to go. That night, Silas slept in a real bed for the first time in weeks. The mattress was new, the blankets rough, the room smelling of fresh-cut pine and paint. He lay there staring at the ceiling and thought about Martha, who would have had opinions about the kitchen layout and the color of the walls and the way the bedroom window faced west instead of east. Sleep came eventually, troubled and thin. The cattle operation slowly stabilized. Miguel had rounded up 90 head by the end of September, and while that was less than they'd started with, it was enough to work with. They'd lost the hay barn and the stored winter feed, which meant buying hay at premium prices, but Cal's money covered it and they made it work. Slowly, grudgingly, Iron Ridge Ranch started to look like a functioning operation again instead of a war zone. In October, Jonah came back from Denver with updates on the federal case. Trial's set for January, he said, spreading papers across the new kitchen table. The prosecutor's confident. We've got testimony from 8 families, documented evidence of fraud, and Dutch Keenan's cooperation. Holloway's lawyers are still fighting, but they're losing ground. What about the attempted murder charges? Silas asked. Those got dropped. Not enough evidence without casualties, but the fraud charges alone are worth 10 to 15 years if they stick. And if they don't? Jonah's expression hardened. Then we make sure they do. I'm testifying. So are you. So has everyone Holloway ever threatened or cheated? We're going to bury him in testimony. The conversation turned to ranch business after that. Herd counts, feed costs, plans for spring. Jonah had ideas about modernizing operations, bringing in better breeding stock, maybe diversifying into sheep or horses. Cal thought they should focus on cattle and do it right before trying anything else. Rhett didn't care as long as someone kept paying for ammunition. They argued like brothers who'd spent too much time together and not enough time apart, and Silas listened to them with something that felt dangerously close to contentment. That evening, after his sons had gone to bed, Silas walked out to the cottonwood trees where Martha and Daniel were buried. The stones were weathered now, lichen growing in the carved letters, but the names were still readable. He stood there in the darkness, hat in his hands, and said the things he'd been too proud or too angry to say before. The boys came back, he said quietly, all 3 of them. They saved the ranch. Saved me, probably. I know you always said they would if I needed them bad enough, and you were right. You were always right about them. The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves with a sound like rushing water, and Silas imagined he could hear Martha laughing at him the way she used to when he admitted she'd been right about something. We're going to make it, he continued. The ranch, I mean. It's going to survive. Whether that matters in the grand scheme of things, I don't know. But it matters to me. It matters to them. So I guess that's enough. He stood there a while longer, then walked back to the new house where his sons slept. And for the first time since Martha died, the ranch didn't feel quite so lonely. November brought the first snow, light and brief, dusting the highlands white for a few hours before melting away. The cattle handled it fine, and Miguel proved himself worth 3 normal ranch hands in his ability to anticipate problems before they became disasters. Cal started talking about heading back to his marshal duties in December, though he kept finding reasons to delay. Rhett came and went unpredictably, sometimes gone for days, sometimes present and working harder than anyone. Jonah stayed through Thanksgiving, helping with the books and making sure their finances were sustainable. They celebrated Thanksgiving in the new kitchen. Simple meal, no ceremony, just the 4 of them and the hired men eating roasted chicken and potatoes. It wasn't fancy, but it was family, and that counted for something. Next year, Silas said during the meal, we'll do this properly. Turkey, stuffing, all of it. Next year, you'll probably be complaining about how much work it is, Cal said. Probably, but I'll do it anyway. They ate in comfortable silence, and Silas looked around the table at his sons. Cal, with his marshal's discipline, Jonah, with his sharp mind, Rhett, with his dangerous competence, and thought about how close he'd come to losing all of them to pride and stubbornness. After dinner, Rhett produced another bottle of whiskey from somewhere, and they sat on the new porch watching the sun go down. You know what the difference is between this porch and the old one? Silas asked. What? Cal said. This one we built together. It was sentimental and obvious, but it was also true, and none of them argued with it. December came cold and clear. The ranch work slowed to winter routines, feeding cattle, maintaining equipment, preparing for the months when the land was frozen and unforgiving. Silas's back hurt less in the cold, which made no medical sense but was true anyway. Word came from Redemption that Holloway had tried to flee the territory and been arrested at the border by federal marshals. His bail was revoked, and he was being held in Santa Fe pending trial. That's good news, Jonah said when he heard. Means he's desperate. Desperate men make mistakes. It also means he's dangerous, Cal added. Cornered animal syndrome. Let him be dangerous from a jail cell, Silas said. I'm tired of worrying about what he might do. They got word in mid-December that Dutch Keenan had given additional testimony, implicating Holloway in crimes going back 5 years. Apparently Keenan had kept records, dates, amounts, details of every intimidation campaign he'd helped run. The federal prosecutor was calling it the most comprehensive evidence of organized land fraud in territorial history. Dutch always was thorough, Silas said when he heard. Guess that's working against his boss now. Christmas came quiet. They didn't have decorations or presents or any of the ceremony Martha used to insist on, but Cal rode into town and came back with a small pine tree that they set up in the corner of the kitchen, and that felt like enough. On Christmas morning, Silas gave each of his sons a pocket knife. Simple tools, nothing fancy, but each one engraved with their initials. Cal gave Silas a new rifle to replace the old Winchester that had seen better days. Jonah gave everyone leather-bound notebooks because that's the kind of practical thing Jonah thought about. Rhett gave everyone ammunition and didn't see why anyone thought that was funny. They spent Christmas Day working on fences because cattle didn't care about holidays and fences didn't fix themselves. But they worked together, and the work felt lighter somehow. That evening, sitting around the kitchen table with coffee and leftover chicken, Silas looked at his sons and said the thing he'd been thinking for weeks. I want you boys to know something. When I die, and don't argue, we all die eventually, this ranch is yours. All 3 of you, equal shares. I've already had the papers drawn up. Dad, Cal started. Let me finish. I don't know if any of you actually want it. Maybe you'll sell it the day after I'm buried. Maybe you'll fight over it. Maybe you'll let it fall apart. But it's yours to decide, not mine. That's all I wanted to say. There was a long silence. Then Jonah said, We're not going to let it fall apart. We're not going to fight over it either, Cal added. And you're not dying anytime soon, Rhett finished. So shut up and drink your coffee. Silas smiled, and for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something that wasn't just survival, something that might actually be called happiness. The new year arrived cold and merciless, bringing with it storms that buried the highlands under 3 feet of snow and turned simple tasks into battles against nature. The cattle huddled in the lee of rocks and arroyos, and Miguel spent every day breaking ice on water troughs and hauling feed to animals that could barely move through the drifts. Silas watched from the kitchen window, guilt gnawing at him because his back wouldn't let him help the way he wanted to. Cal and Polk were out there somewhere checking the northern fence line, and Rhett had ridden into town 2 days ago and hadn't returned yet, which probably meant trouble of one kind or another. Jonah sat at the table writing letters to the federal prosecutor, coordinating testimony for the trial that was now just 3 weeks away. He'd taken a leave of absence from his job in Denver specifically for this, and the intensity with which he worked made it clear he wasn't going to let anything interfere with seeing Holloway convicted. You need to eat something, Silas said, setting a plate of eggs in front of his son. Jonah looked up like he'd forgotten other people existed. What time is it? Near noon. I thought it was morning. It was, 4 hours ago. Jonah rubbed his eyes and picked up the fork mechanically. He'd lost weight since November, burning through calories with nervous energy and obsessive attention to detail. Dark circles lived under his eyes permanently now. You're going to make yourself sick, Silas said. I'm fine. You look like hell. That's just my face. Jonah ate without tasting, still reading papers while he chewed. I got a letter from the prosecutor yesterday. They're adding 2 more fraud counts based on evidence from Dutch Keenan. Also, 3 of Holloway's business partners are testifying against him in exchange for immunity. Rat's leaving a sinking ship. Exactly. Which means Holloway's more isolated than ever. His legal team is down to 1 lawyer. The expensive one from Santa Fe quit last month when Holloway couldn't pay him. Running out of money? Running out of everything. His properties are being seized to cover legal fees, his bank accounts are frozen pending the outcome of civil suits. Even if he somehow beats the criminal charges, he's financially destroyed. Silas poured himself coffee and sat across from Jonah. That should make you happy. It does. It also makes me nervous. Desperate men do desperate things. He's in jail. Yes, but he's still got connections. Still got people who owe him favors or fear him enough to act on his behalf. Jonah set down his fork and met his father's eyes. I've been getting letters. What kind of letters? Threats. Warnings to drop the case, stop cooperating with federal investigators. One of them was specific enough about where I live in Denver that I know someone followed me there. Silas felt ice settle in his stomach. You tell Cal? Not yet. Tell him. It's probably nothing, just intimidation tactics. Jonah, I'll tell him, Jonah said, but after the trial. Right now I need everyone focused on testimony, not on protecting me. Before Silas could argue, the door opened and Cal came in, stamping snow off his boots, his face wind-burned and grim. Northern fence is down, he said without preamble. 50-foot section just collapsed under the snow weight. We've got maybe 20 head of cattle wandered off through the gap. Can it be fixed? Silas asked. Not until the snow melts. Ground's frozen solid. Cal pulled off his gloves and warmed his hands by the stove. We're going to lose some cattle. Can't be helped. It was the practical assessment of someone who'd learned that you couldn't fight everything, but it still hurt to hear. Every head of cattle lost was money they couldn't afford to lose, progress undone, work wasted. We'll rebuild in spring, Silas said, because there wasn't anything else to say. Cal nodded and poured himself coffee. He looked as tired as Jonah, but in a different way, physically exhausted rather than mentally consumed. His hands were cracked and bleeding from cold and rough work, and he moved like every muscle ached. You should rest, Silas said. I will, after I check the southern pastures. Let Polk and Miguel handle it. They're already handling the eastern range. We're spread too thin as it is. Cal drank his coffee standing up, too restless to sit. Where's Rhett? Town. Been gone 2 days. Doing what? You really want to know? Cal thought about that. Probably not. They stood there in the kitchen, 3 Mercer men in various states of exhaustion, holding together a ranch that kept trying to fall apart. Outside, the wind howled and snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the storm were cattle they'd probably never recover. We're going to make it, Silas said, not sure if he believed it, but needing to say it anyway. Neither of his sons responded, which was answer enough. Rhett returned the next day with news that complicated everything. He rode in after dark, his horse lathered despite the cold, and came into the house shedding snow like a ghost materializing from the storm. We've got a problem, he said. Cal looked up from the account books he'd been reviewing. What kind of problem? The kind where Holloway's lawyer contacted 3 witnesses and offered them money to change their testimony. Jonah's head snapped up. Which witnesses? Henderson's daughter, the Talbot family, and Agnes Pruitt from the post office. Did any of them take the money? Cal asked. No, but they're scared. Agnes especially. She's old and alone, and someone broke into her house last week. Didn't take anything, just left things moved around so she'd know they'd been there. That's witness intimidation, Jonah said, already reaching for paper and pen. That's a federal crime on top of everything else. That's also effective, Rhett said. If the witnesses won't testify, your case falls apart. They'll testify. I'll make sure of it. How? You're going to protect all of them personally? There are 8 families involved, plus Agnes, plus the business partners who flipped. You can't guard everyone. The room went quiet. Outside, wind rattled the windows and threw snow against the walls, and inside 4 men tried to figure out how to fight an enemy who wouldn't die. We need law enforcement, Cal said finally. Real law enforcement. Federal marshals who can provide protection. Trial's in 3 weeks, Jonah said. I can request witness protection, but getting it approved and implemented takes time we don't have. Then we do it ourselves, Silas said. They all looked at him. We've got 4 of us, plus Polk and Miguel if they're willing. We split up, each of us takes the witnesses we can reach, we make sure they get to Santa Fe safely, and stay safe until they testify. That's not sustainable, Cal said. We can protect them for a few days, maybe a week, but 3 weeks? With ranch work and weather and Holloway's people actively trying to interfere? We'll fail. You got a better idea? Cal didn't. They spent the next hour making plans anyway, because that's what you did when there were no good options. You picked the least bad one and tried to make it work. Jonah made a list of all the witnesses and their locations. Cal mapped out routes and timing. Rhett calculated how many men Holloway might still have available to cause trouble. The math didn't favor them, but it never had. 2 days later, Jonah rode to the Henderson place to check on the family and found the daughter's testimony had already changed. Not dramatically, she still said her family had been intimidated into selling, but the details had gotten vaguer, the timeline less certain, the specific accusations softer. Someone got to her, Jonah reported when he returned. She's terrified, wouldn't look me in the eye. Her husband kept trying to get her to stop talking altogether. Can we still use her testimony? Cal asked. Technically, yes, but a defense lawyer will tear her apart on cross-examination. If she hesitates or contradicts herself, it undermines everything. So we lost a witness. We lost a strong witness. She'll still testify, but she's wounded now. Silas listened to his sons discuss legal strategy and witness reliability and felt frustration building. This was Holloway's game. Obscure the truth, spread fear, make people doubt themselves until the whole case collapsed under the weight of uncertainty. He was fighting from a jail cell and still winning. What about Dutch Keenan? Silas asked. Can they get to him? He's in federal custody, Jonah said. They can't touch him. Then we focus on what we can control. The other witnesses, making sure they get to trial, making sure they feel safe enough to tell the truth. It sounded simple when Silas said it, but implementation was something else entirely. Over the next week, Cal visited the Talbot family personally and spent 3 hours convincing them that testifying was worth the risk. Rhett rode out to check on Agnes Pruitt and found her so frightened she'd stopped sleeping at night, sitting in her kitchen with a shotgun across her lap. He stayed with her for 2 days, sleeping in her barn, making sure she knew someone was watching. Jonah coordinated with the federal prosecutor, trying to expedite witness protection and getting tangled in bureaucratic delays. The prosecutor was sympathetic but overworked, handling 3 other major cases simultaneously, and the wheels of federal justice ground slowly. Meanwhile, the ranch work continued because cattle didn't care about legal battles. Miguel kept the herd fed and watered, Polk fixed equipment and maintained buildings. Silas did what he could with his failing back and tried not to feel useless. January 15th arrived, 1 week before the trial, and Jonah received a telegram that made him go pale. What is it? Cal asked. Satil, 2 of Holloway's business partners just withdrew their testimony. They're claiming they were coerced by federal investigators and their previous statements were false. Can they do that? They just did. That's perjury. Prove it. Their new lawyer is claiming prosecutorial misconduct, and without their testimony, we lose 2 fraud counts and most of the conspiracy case. Cal swore creatively. How many witnesses do we have left? Jonah counted on his fingers. Agnes, the Talbots, if they don't lose their nerve, the Henderson girl with compromised testimony, Dutch Keenan, and us. That's it. That's what's left of 8 families and a dozen business associates. Is it enough? I don't know. Maybe. If everyone holds together and testifies clearly, and the jury believes us over Holloway's lawyers. Jonah looked sick. We're watching the case fall apart in real time. That evening, sitting around the kitchen table in silence, Silas felt something he hadn't felt during the actual shooting war with Holloway, the sense that they were losing. Not dramatically, not in one catastrophic defeat, but slowly, inevitably, ground down by an enemy with more resources and fewer scruples. We could withdraw, he said quietly. His sons looked at him like he'd suggested burning the ranch themselves. I'm serious. We could tell the prosecutor we're done, let Holloway plead out to reduce charges, take whatever justice we can get, and move on with our lives. Absolutely not, Jonah said. Why not? We've already lost half our witnesses. The case is falling apart. Holloway's lawyers are going to shred what's left. Because giving up now means everything we went through was for nothing, Cal said. The burned house, the dead cattle, the night we nearly got killed, all of it becomes meaningless if we walk away before seeing this through. And because he needs to pay, Rhett added quietly. Not just legally. He needs to know that what he did had consequences, that the Mercers don't fold. Silas looked at his sons, Jonah exhausted and obsessive, Cal disciplined and angry, Rhett dangerous and committed, and realized they needed this trial more than they needed safety. They needed to see Holloway judged and punished, not just for the ranch's sake, but for their own. All right, he said, we see it through to the end. The week before the trial passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Jonah rewrote his testimony 17 times, trying to anticipate every question a defense lawyer might ask. Cal contacted the territorial marshal's office and arranged for deputies to escort witnesses to Santa Fe. Rhett visited each remaining witness personally, making it clear through presence alone that anyone who threatened them would have to deal with him first. And Silas practiced his own testimony, standing in front of the kitchen mirror and trying to sound calm and credible instead of angry and old. You're overthinking it, Cal said, watching him rehearse. Just tell the truth. The truth is I hate Vern Holloway, and I want to see him hang. That's not going to sound objective. Then tell the truth around that. What he did, what you saw, what you lost. Let the hate come through if it needs to. Juries understand anger. On January 20th, they loaded a wagon and prepared to ride to Santa Fe. The trial started in 2 days, and witnesses were required to arrive early for final preparation. Silas packed his one good suit, the photograph of Martha and the boys, and the Winchester rifle he'd carried through everything else. You can't bring a gun into the courthouse, Jonah said. I'm not leaving it behind either. They compromised by agreeing Silas would leave it at whatever hotel they stayed at, though privately, Silas had no intention of being anywhere unarmed. Miguel and Polk would stay behind to manage the ranch. Miguel looked worried, and Polk looked like he always looked, neutral and watchful. Keep the cattle alive, Cal told them. Everything else can wait until we get back. And if you don't come back, Miguel asked, then the ranch is yours. Papers are in the desk drawer. They left at dawn, 4 Mercer men riding toward Santa Fe and a reckoning that had been building for months. The journey would take 2 days in good weather, longer if the storms continued. They rode in silence mostly, each man alone with his thoughts. Silas thought about Martha, who would have hated all of this but would have stood beside him anyway. Thought about Daniel, who died too young to see his brothers become the men they'd become. Thought about the land they were fighting for and whether it was worth the cost. The first day passed without incident. They stopped at a way station for the night, paying for beds in a communal room that smelled like old sweat and wood smoke. Silas barely slept, his back aching from the ride, his mind racing through testimony and questions and all the ways this could go wrong. The second day brought problems. They were maybe 20 miles from Santa Fe when riders appeared on the road behind them, 5 men moving fast and purposeful. Cal saw them first and his hand moved to his pistol. We've got company, he said quietly. Silas turned in his saddle. The riders were close enough now to recognize, and what he saw made his stomach drop. Ray Cullen's brother, a man named Pike, who'd worked for Holloway before, and 3 others he didn't know. That's Pike Cullen, Silas said. Ray's younger brother. The one Rhett killed? Cal asked. I didn't kill Ray, Rhett said calmly. He died in a saloon fight. Everyone knows that. Pike doesn't look like he's coming to discuss it peacefully. The riders were close now, spreading out to cut off escape routes. Pike Cullen rode in the center, a big man with his brother's mean eyes and a rifle across his saddle. Mercer, he shouted, stop right there. They stopped because running would just get them shot in the back. Pike rode up close, his companions flanking him in a practiced formation. They'd done this before. The intimidation, the positioning, the threat without explicit violence. You boys heading to Santa Fe? Pike asked, though he clearly knew the answer. We are, Cal said. His voice was level, professional, the tone of a lawman who'd dealt with dangerous men before. That's unfortunate. See, my brother died because of you Mercers, and I don't think it's right that you get to ride to trial like nothing happened. Your brother died in a fair fight, Rhett said. If you've got a problem with that, we can settle it the same way. Pike's hand twitched toward his gun, but one of his companions grabbed his arm. Not here, the man said quietly. Too public. Pike settled back, but his eyes promised violence. You're not going to make it to that trial. You know that, right? Somewhere between here and Santa Fe, something's going to happen. Maybe bandits, maybe an accident, maybe you just disappear. That a threat? Cal asked. That's a prediction. They stared at each other across 15 feet of dusty road. Two groups of armed men with incompatible goals and no interest in compromise. Then Jonah did something unexpected. He pulled out a notebook and started writing. What are you doing? Pike demanded. Documenting this encounter. Date, time, location, witnesses present, specific threats made. Jonah looked up with those sharp, calculating eyes. This is witness intimidation, which is a federal crime. And threatening federal witnesses on their way to testify is something the court takes very seriously. I didn't threaten anyone. I made a prediction. You predicted that we wouldn't make it to trial. That's a threat. And I'm documenting it for the prosecutor. Jonah kept writing. Pike Cullen, affiliated with Vern Holloway's organization, intercepted federal witnesses 20 miles south of Santa Fe on January 21st. Made specific threats regarding their safety. Accompanied by 4 armed men, identities unknown. You're making a mistake, Pike said, but he sounded less certain now. No, you made the mistake. Because now when we arrive safely in Santa Fe and report this to federal marshals, they're going to come looking for you. And if anything happens to us between here and there, you're the first person they'll arrest. It was a bluff, mostly, but it was delivered with enough confidence that Pike's companions started looking nervous. One of them said something to Pike that Silas couldn't hear. Pike stared at the Mercers with pure hatred. This isn't over. Yes, it is, Cal said quietly. Right away while you still can. For a long moment, Silas thought Pike was going to draw anyway. Consequences be damned. His hand hovered near his pistol, his jaw tight, his whole body coiled for violence. Then he wheeled his horse and rode off, his companions following. The Mercers waited until they disappeared over a ridge before relaxing. That was a hell of a bluff, Cal said to Jonah. Wasn't entirely a bluff. I did document everything, and if they try anything, we've got a witness statement ready to file. Assuming we survive to file it, Rhett said. They rode the rest of the way to Santa Fe with heightened alertness, eyes scanning every ridge and arroyo for ambush, but nothing happened. Maybe Pike decided it wasn't worth the risk. Maybe Jonah's documentation had worked, or maybe they just got lucky. They reached Santa Fe that evening as the sun was setting, the city sprawling across hills like something from a different world compared to the harsh highlands they'd left behind. Buildings crowded together, streets bustled with people, and somewhere in all of it was a courthouse where Vern Holloway would finally face justice. Or escape it entirely. They'd find out soon enough. The hotel they found was called the Territorial Arms, a 3-story building that had seen better decades and smelled like tobacco and old carpet. Silas paid for 2 rooms, one for himself and Cal, one for Jonah and Rhett, and they hauled their bags upstairs in silence, each man processing the encounter with Pike Cullen in his own way. That night Silas couldn't sleep. He stood at the window watching Santa Fe at night, lanterns glowing in windows, people moving through streets like life was normal and safe. Somewhere in this city, Holloway sat in a cell preparing his defense. Somewhere else, witnesses were second-guessing their courage. And somewhere out there, Pike Cullen was probably planning another attempt to stop them. Cal was awake too, sitting on his bed cleaning his pistol by lamplight. You think we'll win? Silas asked without turning from the window. I think we'll find out tomorrow. That's not an answer. Cal was quiet for a moment, then said, I think justice is a thing people want to believe in more than it actually exists. We've got truth on our side, but Holloway's got money and lawyers and a system that's designed to protect men like him. So no, I don't know if we'll win. I just know we're going to try. It was the most honest answer Silas had heard in weeks, and somehow that made it easier to accept. The federal courthouse was an imposing stone structure that looked like it had been built to intimidate people into honesty. Silas and his sons arrived early, dressed in their best clothes, looking like exactly what they were. Frontier men uncomfortable in formal settings. The prosecutor was a lean woman in her 40s named Rebecca Chen, with sharp eyes and the kind of focused intensity that reminded Silas of Jonah. She met them in a preparation room and went over testimony one final time. "The defense is going to attack your credibility," she said, looking at each of them in turn. "They're going to suggest you fabricated threats, exaggerated damages, conspired together to frame an innocent businessman. Stay calm, stick to facts, don't let them provoke you into anger." "What if I am angry?" Silas asked. "Then be angry about what happened, not about being questioned. The jury needs to see you as a victim seeking justice, not a vindictive old man seeking revenge." "What's the difference?" Chen smiled slightly. "Presentation." They spent 2 hours rehearsing questions and answers, going over timeline details, making sure their stories aligned without sounding rehearsed. By the time they finished, Silas's head hurt and his back was screaming, but he felt as prepared as he was going to get. The courtroom was already packed when they entered. Families they recognized, the Talbots, the Hendersons, others who'd suffered under Holloway's intimidation, sat in the gallery looking nervous. Agnes Pruitt was there too, looking small and frail and somehow fierce anyway. And in the front, surrounded by 3 expensive-looking lawyers, sat Vern Holloway. He'd lost weight since Silas had seen him last. His expensive suit hung loose on his frame, and his face had the gray pallor of someone who'd spent months in a cell. But his eyes were the same, small and mean and filled with the kind of arrogance that came from a lifetime of getting away with things. When Holloway saw the Mercers, he smiled. It was the smile of a man who thought he was still going to win, and it made Silas want to cross the courtroom and punch him in the mouth. Cal must have sensed it because he put a hand on Silas's arm and said quietly, "Not here." The judge entered, a gray-haired man named Morrison, who had a reputation for running a tight courtroom and tolerating no nonsense from either side. He settled into his chair, looked over the assembled lawyers and witnesses and jury, and said, "Counselors, are we ready to proceed?" The trial began. Chen's opening statement was precise and methodical, laying out a pattern of intimidation, fraud, and violence that stretched across 3 years and destroyed dozens of families. She spoke about burned barns and poisoned cattle, about forged documents and threatened witnesses, about an empire built on fear and maintained through cruelty. Holloway's lead defense attorney, a man named Thornton who wore his competence like armor, responded with a different story. His client was a successful businessman who'd made legitimate offers for properties. If sellers felt pressured, that was their perception, not his client's intent. If accidents happened to those who refused to sell, that was coincidence, not conspiracy. And if witnesses claimed otherwise, they were either mistaken or motivated by the kind of resentment unsuccessful people felt toward successful ones. It was a masterful reframing, and Silas watched the jury absorb it with growing dread. The first witness was Dutch Keenan. He took the stand looking older than his years, wearing federal prisoner clothes and the haunted expression of someone who'd made choices he couldn't unmake. Chen walked him through his employment with Holloway, the orders he'd received, the things he'd been paid to do. "Mr. Holloway instructed you to burn the Mercer barn?" Chen asked. "Yes, ma'am." "And did you carry out that instruction?" Dutch hesitated, then nodded. "I did." "Why?" "Because that's what I was paid for. To pressure people into selling, to make their lives difficult enough that Holloway's offers started looking better. And if they still refused, then things escalated." Thornton's cross-examination was brutal. He attacked Dutch's credibility, pointed out his immunity deal, suggested he was fabricating testimony to save himself from prison. By the time he finished, Dutch looked shaken and the jury looked skeptical. Agnes Pruitt testified next, and her age worked in her favor. She spoke clearly about seeing Holloway's men in town, overhearing conversations, handling telegrams and letters that coordinated the intimidation campaign. Thornton tried to suggest her memory was failing, but she shut him down with the kind of sharp practicality that came from 80 years of taking no one's nonsense. "My memory is fine, young man," she said. "I remember what I saw, and I saw plenty." The Talbots testified about their barn burning and the threats that followed. The Henderson daughter gave her compromised testimony, voice shaking, losing confidence under Thornton's questioning. One by one, Chen built her case, and one by one, Thornton chipped away at it. Then it was Jonah's turn. He took the stand with his notebooks and documentation, and for 2 hours he walked the jury through a conspiracy so detailed and well-documented that even Thornton couldn't fully dismantle it. Jonah had bank records showing payments to known criminals, property deeds with forged signatures, testimony from sellers who'd been threatened, a timeline that connected incidents to subsequent sales with damning precision. This wasn't random, Jonah said, looking directly at the jury. This was systematic. Holloway identified properties he wanted, sent his men to make life unbearable for the owners, then swooped in with offers that seemed generous only because he'd made the alternative so terrible. Thornton tried to shake him on cross-examination, but Jonah had anticipated every question and had documentation for every answer. By the time he stepped down, even Thornton looked frustrated. Cal testified about his investigation as a territorial marshal, the patterns he'd seen, the evidence he'd gathered. He spoke with the authority of someone who'd spent years upholding law, and the jury listened. Then it was Silas's turn. He walked to the witness stand on legs that felt unsteady, sat down in the chair, and placed his hand on the Bible for the oath. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Chen started with easy questions, his name, his age, how long he'd owned Iron Ridge Ranch. Then she moved into harder territory. Mr. Mercer, did Vern Holloway ever approach you about purchasing your property? Yes, ma'am. His men came to my ranch with an offer. And what was your response? I told them I wasn't selling. What happened after you refused? Silas took a breath and told it all. The barn fire, the poisoned cattle, the cut fences, the threats. He described the night of the attack, the house burning, standing in a rifle pit wondering if he'd see morning. He spoke about watching 40 years of his life turn to ash because one man wanted land that wasn't his to take. Chen let him talk, and when he finished, she asked one more question. Mr. Mercer, in your opinion, was Vern Holloway trying to intimidate you into selling? It wasn't just my opinion, ma'am. It was fact. He sent armed men to threaten me. He destroyed my property. He tried to kill me and my sons. That's not business. That's terrorism. Thornton objected to the characterization, and Judge Morrison sustained it, but the word hung in the courtroom anyway. Then came cross-examination. Thornton stood and approached with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where to strike. Mr. Mercer, you said your barn burned down. Do you have proof it was arson? I know what I know. That's not an answer. Do you have physical evidence, accelerants, witness statements, forensic analysis that proves the fire was deliberately set? The fire started in the middle of the night in the center of the hay. That's speculation. Do you have proof? Silas gritted his teeth. No. And the poisoned cattle. Did you have the water tested by a laboratory? No, but so you don't actually know what killed them. I know my cattle were fine until someone poisoned the trough. Or they died of natural causes and you assumed poison because it fit your narrative. Thornton walked back to his table, letting that sink in. Mr. Mercer, isn't it true that you owed significant money on your property? I don't owe anyone anything. The ranch is paid for. But it's struggling financially, isn't it? Barely profitable, requiring constant investment, bleeding money? All ranches require investment. And when my client made you a generous offer, you saw an opportunity to not only sell at above market value, but to manufacture a victim narrative that might generate sympathy and additional compensation. That's a lie. Is it? Or is it simply a reasonable business decision dressed up as persecution? Chen objected and the judge sustained it, but again the damage was done. Thornton had planted doubt. He pressed harder. Mr. Mercer, you have 3 sons, all of whom testified today. Isn't it convenient that they all tell exactly the same story? We tell the same story because it's the truth. Or because you coordinated your testimony to present a unified front against a man you resent for being more successful than you. My sons weren't even there when Holloway's men first came. They came home because I asked them to. After you'd already decided to refuse my client's offer and needed reinforcements to support that decision, Silas felt anger building, hot and dangerous. I asked my sons to come home because I was being threatened and attacked. Because men with guns were burning my property and promising worse. I didn't need reinforcements to refuse an offer. I needed help to survive. Very dramatic, Mr. Mercer. But the fact remains that you have no concrete proof of these alleged attacks, just convenient timing and a family willing to support your story. I have a burned house. I have poisoned cattle. I have witnesses who saw Holloway's men. You have property damage that could have multiple causes and witnesses with their own motivations for testifying against my client. Thornton turned to the jury. What you don't have is proof of intent, proof of conspiracy, proof of anything except that bad things happened and you've decided to blame Vern Holloway for all of it. Chen objected again, but Silas could see it in the jury's faces. Some of them were buying it. Thornton had done exactly what he'd warned against, provoked anger, and used it to suggest irrationality. When Silas stepped down from the stand, he felt like he'd failed. The trial continued for 3 more days. More witnesses, more evidence, more legal maneuvering. Holloway himself took the stand and performed masterfully, regretful about misunderstandings, sympathetic to families who'd suffered losses, but adamant that he'd done nothing illegal or immoral. He was just a businessman making offers, and if people chose to sell, that was their decision. Chen's closing argument was passionate and detailed, tying together all the evidence into a comprehensive case for conspiracy and fraud. But Thornton's closing was equally compelling, casting doubt on every piece of evidence, questioning every witness's motives, painting Holloway as a successful man being torn down by jealous failures. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Silas spent those days pacing the hotel room, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to do anything except replay his testimony and Thornton's cross-examination and wonder if he'd cost them everything. "Stop torturing yourself," Cal said on the second day. "We did what we could. The rest is up to the jury." "What if they don't believe us?" "Then we live with it and move on." "How can you be so calm?" "I'm not calm. I'm just better at hiding it." On the afternoon of the second day, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. They assembled in the courtroom, witnesses, families, lawyers, judge, and jury. Holloway sat at the defense table looking confident, and Silas wanted to believe that was false bravado, but couldn't quite convince himself. Judge Morrison asked the jury foreman if they'd reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, how do you find?" "Guilty." The word hit like a physical blow. Silas felt Cal grip his shoulder, heard someone in the gallery gasp. "On the charge of fraud, in the sale of the Henderson property?" "Guilty." "On the charge of fraud in the sale of the Talbot property?" "Guilty." Count after count, guilty verdicts piled up. Not all of them. Some of the attempted murder charges didn't stick. Some of the lesser fraud counts came back not guilty. But enough. More than enough. When it was over, Vern Holloway had been convicted on 7 counts of fraud and conspiracy, carrying a combined sentence of 12 to 18 years in territorial prison. Holloway's face went white. His lawyers immediately started preparing appeals, but Judge Morrison set bail so high that there was no chance of Holloway walking out of that courtroom a free man. Chen turned to the Mercers with something that might have been a smile. "We won." Silas couldn't speak. He just nodded and felt tears he hadn't known were building start to run down his face. Outside the courthouse, families gathered, people who'd lost land or cattle or homes, people who'd been too afraid to fight back until someone else stood first. They didn't celebrate exactly, but there was a sense of something lifting, a weight removed. Agnes Pruitt found Silas and gripped his hand with surprising strength. "You did it," she said. "You stubborn old fool, you actually did it." "We did it," Silas corrected. "All of us." "No, you started it. You drew the line. The rest of us just followed." The Hendersons thanked them, and the Talbots, and families Silas barely knew but who'd suffered under Holloway's empire. One by one, they expressed gratitude or relief or just the simple acknowledgement that justice, however imperfect, had been served. That night, the 4 Mercer men sat in the hotel room with a bottle of whiskey Rhett had procured from somewhere, passing it around in silence. They'd won, but it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like survival with paperwork. 12 to 18 years, Jonah said finally. "He'll probably serve 10 with good behavior." 10 years is a long time, Cal said. "Not long enough for what he did. Not long enough for the families he destroyed or the people who disappeared or the—" Jonah stopped, took a drink. "I wanted him to die in prison. I wanted him to lose everything the way he made others lose everything." "He's losing plenty," Silas said. "His empire's gone, his money's gone, his reputation's destroyed. 10 years in prison might as well be a lifetime for a man like him." "You sound satisfied," Rhett observed. "I sound tired." Silas leaned back against the wall, feeling every one of his 64 years. "I wanted justice, and we got it. That's more than most people get." They drank in silence, and somewhere in the passing of the bottle between father and sons, something settled that had been broken for a long time. What now? Cal asked eventually. Now we go home, Silas said. We rebuild what needs rebuilding and we move forward. You going to stay at the ranch? Jonah asked Cal. For a while, until things stabilize. Then I've got marshal duties to get back to. And you? Silas asked Jonah. Back to Denver, but I'll visit more, I promise. They both looked at Rhett, who shrugged. I go where the work is, but Iron Ridge is home. I'll be around. It wasn't a commitment to stay forever, but it was more than Silas had expected and better than nothing. They returned to the ranch a week later to find Miguel and Polk had kept things running smoothly. The cattle were fed, the critical fences were maintained, and nothing had burned down, which felt like a victory in itself. The ranch looked different now. The new house still strange, the burned barn still a skeleton, the land still scarred by violence. But it was theirs. Completely, undeniably, permanently theirs. Spring came slowly to the highlands, bringing with it the kind of work that left no time for dwelling on the past. They rebuilt the hay barn larger and better than before. They replaced the southern fence line with stronger posts sunk deeper. They brought in new breeding stock and started improving the herd. Cal stayed through April, working alongside his father and brothers until the ranch was truly stable again. Then one morning he saddled his horse and said it was time to go. Marshal business? Silas asked. Something like that. They stood in the yard where everything had started, where Holloway's men had first delivered their threats, where the final battle had been fought. Thank you, Silas said, for coming when I called, for standing with me, for everything. Cal nodded, uncomfortable with sentiment but accepting it anyway. You would have done the same. I hope I would have. You would have, because we're Mercers, and Mercers don't abandon family. He rode out that afternoon, and Silas watched him disappear over the eastern ridge with a mixture of sadness and pride. Jonah left in May, returning to his federal work but promising to visit for Christmas. He'd lost the obsessive edge that had consumed him during the trial, replaced by something quieter and maybe healthier. Rhett stayed through summer, working the ranch and occasionally disappearing for days at a time on business he never explained. Silas stopped asking questions, accepting that his youngest son lived a life that wasn't meant for full disclosure. But one evening in late August, Rhett said something unexpected. I'm thinking about staying, he said. They were sitting on the porch watching sunset paint the canyons orange and gold, the kind of evening that made the hardness of the land feel almost gentle. Here? Silas asked. Permanently? Maybe. I'm tired of hunting, tired of moving. This place, Rhett gestured at the ranch spread out before them. It's not easy, but it's honest work, and I could use some honest in my life. Silas didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and let the sunset speak for both of them. Fall brought news that Vern Holloway had been transferred to the territorial prison in Yuma, one of the harshest facilities in the Southwest. His appeals had been denied, his assets seized to pay restitution to families he'd defrauded, his empire completely dismantled. He'll die there, Jonah wrote in a letter. Maybe not physically, but everything that made him who he was is already dead. He's just serving time until his body catches up. Silas read the letter twice, then burned it in the stove. He didn't need to think about Holloway anymore. That chapter was closed. Winter came again, harsh and cold, but the ranch survived it better than the year before. They had hay stored, fences maintained, cattle healthy. Miguel had proven himself so valuable that Silas made him foreman. Polk had become a permanent fixture, saying little but working hard and occasionally displaying skills that suggested his past was as complicated as Rhett's. On Christmas Eve, all three sons came home. Cal arrived first, looking tired but good. Jonah came next, bringing gifts and updates about the federal cases he was working on. Rhett had never left, but he cleaned up and shaved for the occasion, which counted as festive by his standards. They cooked a proper Christmas dinner this time. Turkey that Sam the carpenter had helped them hunt, potatoes and gravy, and bread Agnes Pruitt had baked and sent out with Cal. The new kitchen table was crowded with food and family, and for the first time since Martha died, the house felt full. After dinner, Silas stood and raised his glass. I want to say something, he started, then stopped, not sure how to express what he felt. His sons waited. A year ago, this ranch was falling apart, and I was alone and about ready to give up. I sent 3 letters because I was desperate and stubborn and too proud to admit I couldn't do it by myself. He looked at each of them. You came. You stood beside me. You fought for this place like it was yours because it is yours. And I want you to know." His voice broke. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I want you to know that this land isn't what matters. You are. The three of you. Everything I built here was supposed to be for you, and somewhere along the way I forgot that and started thinking the land was the point. But it's not. You're the point. And whether you stay here or leave, whether you work this ranch or sell it after I'm gone, I'm proud of you, all of you." There was a long silence, then Cal raised his glass. "To Iron Ridge and to the stubborn old man who wouldn't let it die." They drank to that, and to Martha, and to Daniel, and to survival. Later that night, standing at the cottonwood trees where his wife and youngest son were buried, Silas spoke to them one last time. "We made it," he said quietly. "The boys came home, we saved the ranch, we got justice. I don't know what comes next, but I know we'll face it together. And that's enough. That has to be enough." The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves with its familiar rushing water sound, and Silas chose to believe that was Martha's way of agreeing. He walked back to the house where his sons were still talking and laughing, where light spilled from windows into the darkness, where family had been rebuilt from ashes and distance, and old wounds that had finally started to heal. The land would endure. It always had. Stone and dust and stubborn grass that grew despite everything. But what mattered, what had always mattered, was the people willing to defend it. Not because the land was sacred, but because it represented something larger than dirt and fences. It represented identity, sacrifice, memory, and the kind of love that refused to quit even when quitting made sense. Vern Holloway had measured Iron Ridge in acres and profit, calculating value the way a banker calculates interest. But the Mercers measured it differently. They measured it in fence posts set by hand, in cattle raised through brutal winters, in a wife buried under cottonwoods and a son who died too young, and 3 children who came home when called. That was the difference between owning land and belonging to it. And in the end, that difference was everything. Years later, when travelers passed through Redemption and asked about the Mercer Ranch, old-timers would tell the story of the war that had been fought there. Details would shift and embellish with each retelling, the number of attackers growing, the battles becoming more dramatic, the victory more absolute. But the core truth remained constant. An old rancher had drawn a line, his sons had stood beside him, and together they'd proven that some things, family, honor, the refusal to be broken, couldn't be bought or burned or intimidated into submission. Iron Ridge Ranch survived. The Mercers survived. And while that might not change the world, it changed their world. And sometimes that was the only victory worth fighting for. The land would outlast them all. It was stone and distance and brutal beauty that predated human ambition and would persist long after human concerns became dust. But while the Mercers lived, while they worked and fought and refused to surrender, the land was theirs not because they owned it on paper, but because they'd earned it through blood and sweat, and the kind of stubborn determination that defined frontier survival. That was the legacy. Not wealth or fame or empire, but the simple, profound truth that some people couldn't be moved, couldn't be bought, couldn't be erased. They stood their ground because the ground was worth standing for, and in standing, they became something larger than themselves. They became the story people told when they needed to believe that courage still mattered, that justice was possible, that ordinary people facing impossible odds could still win if they refused to quit. And in a territory where stories were currency and reputation was survival, that was worth more than all of Vern Holloway's money and power combined. Silas Mercer died 7 years later in his sleep in the house his sons had helped rebuild. He was 71 years old. They buried him beside Martha under the cottonwood trees, and his sons stood over the grave understanding what their father had spent a lifetime teaching them. Land wasn't just dirt and fences. It was identity. It was memory. It was the refusal to let fear or greed or violence define what mattered. And it was worth defending not because it was perfect, but because it was theirs. Cal went back to marshaling. Jonah continued his federal work. Rhett stayed at the ranch, taking over operations and running Iron Ridge with the same quiet competence he'd once applied to hunting bounties. And the land endured, generation after generation, because some legacies were built to last. That was the story of Iron Ridge Ranch. Not a tale of heroes or villains, but of flawed people making difficult choices and living with the consequences. A family broken and rebuilt. of justice pursued and partially achieved, of survival earned one brutal day at a time. It wasn't a perfect story, but it was true in the ways that mattered. And years later, when people asked why the Mercers had fought so hard for a piece of difficult land in the harsh New Mexico highlands, the answer was always the same: because it was theirs, and that was enough.